A thin drizzle clung to the cobblestones of Belgrave Square as the hansom cab came to a halt. Before No. 17 unimposing, ivy-clad townhouse whose elegance whispered old money and older secrets. It was 5:30 in the morning, and the faint light from the street lamps cast long shadows through the mist. Sherlock Holmes stepped down, a glint of anticipation in his eyes. Beside him, I followed in silence. The telegram still fresh in my coat pocket. Murder at the Pembroke estate. Butler resigned yesterday. No sign of forced entry. Victim, Lord Elmer Pembroke. Request immediate assistance. Inspector Lester Death's front door stood ajar when we arrived, guarded by a solitary constable who nodded grimly and led us inside. The entrance hall was immaculate to immaculate, not a smudge of dirt from the rain. No signs of hasty movement. Everything in its place, except, of course, for Lord Pembroke, who lay face down in his study, a decanter of brandy shattered near, his hand and a dark red halo slowly soaking into the Persian rug. Holmes crouched by the body while Lestrade filled us in. No forced entry. Windows locked from inside. Servants all accounted for except the butler, who handed in his resignation just yesterday. Walked out late evening. Left a written note. No reason given. No screams. Holmes asked. Eyes scanning the room. None heard. The maid found him during her morning routine. All doors locked. She had to fetch the spare key. And what of the study? Holmes gestured around. Anything disturbed? Lestrade shook his head. Only the glass, the desks untouched. No sign of struggle. I glanced around. Mahogany shelves lined with neatly arranged volumes, a ticking grandfather clock, a half-burnt log in the fireplace. It was a room meant to soothe, not to murder. And yet here lay Lord Pembroke, lifeless, without a mark upon him save a faint bruise on the temple, more like a fall than a blow. Holmes pointed to the decanter, smashed where it fell, but note the lack of splatter. No droplets beyond a 2-foot radius. Odd. Considering the angle. Watson, your opinion? I crouched. Beside him, the brandy stain seemed shallow. The injury on the head is minor. Could be post-mortem. Perhaps poison? Holmes nodded once, eyes already flicking elsewhere. Quite so. But look here. He rose and strode to the writing desk. The pen is uncapped. A blot of ink on the pad, but no letter begun, as if he were interrupted mid-thought. Maybe the killer surprised him, Lestrade offered, or he knew his killer and let him in, Holmes said. Let us speak of the butler. Name, Martin Bexley. In service for 12 years. No complaints. No quarrels. His note was terse. I resign with immediate effect. I regret I cannot continue. That's all. Holmes closed his eyes, then murmured, Watson, help me examine the door. We moved to it together. The lock was undisturbed. No scratches or signs of tampering. A heavy brass key still sat in the keyhole from the inside. Locked from within. That much is clear, Holmes said. Now the windows. Each window was latched tight, with dust gathered on the sills except one. The rightmost pane bore the faintest scuff. Not a print, but a disturbance in the layer of dust. Holmes smiled faintly. Someone opened this from within recently. See, here, the latch still has a soft smear of oil. But if it was opened, I said, it must have been relocked afterward. From the inside, Holmes turned slowly, unless the window appears locked. He worked the latch. It clicked easily, but a closer look revealed a thin sliver of wood wedged beneath the mechanism. A trick something used to keep it shut. Even after being relocked from outside, curious, Holmes said, a staged lock suggests someone wanted the illusion of security. Watson, we are no longer dealing with a spontaneous act. Lestrade frowned. But why would the butler resign? The day before the murder? That is precisely the question. And why did Lord Pembroke sit down to write, and then stop? Something startled him, or someone arrived. We questioned the household. The maid swore she heard nothing unusual. The cook was in the cellar preparing preserves. The valet had retired early with a migraine and produced a doctor's note. Martin Bexley, however, had vanished. I want that resignation note. Holmes said .lestrade retrieved it. Holmes read it thrice, then held it to the light. Notice, the pressure of the pen strong, deliberate. But look how the second line slopes downward, nervous, perhaps even frightened. He sniffed the paper. Lavender, not common for men's writing desks. This paper is also heavier stock than household stationery. Bexley didn't write this here. He opened the writing desk again. Watson, we must visit Bexley's residence. But first, one final detail. He returned to the body and gingerly turned over Pembroke's right hand, as I suspected. Ink beneath the fingernail, but none on the fingers, and a faint crease along the palm. He was holding something that was removed. Holmes stood. Our killer left no mess, but he left a vacuum. Someone took something from this room, something Pembroke tried to write about but never finished. Outside, dawn had begun to warm the sky, but Holmes was already steps ahead, eyes blazing with deduction. Come, Watson. The game begins with the man who walked away before the murder, and may yet be the only one who knows why it happened. By the time Holmes and I reached Martin Bexley's lodgings on Grafton Street, the city had begun to stir. The milkmen clattered down cobbled lanes, and newsboys shouted headlines none could yet imagine. Were tethered to murder, the landlord, a wrinkled man with perpetual irritation lining his brow, answered our knock with visible annoyance that quickly melted when Holmes identified himself. Bexley, he said, scratching his chin, took off in a rush last night, around 9, packed a single valise, said he had urgent family matters up in Leeds. Funny thing though, he left half his clothes behind. Not a man who usually travels light. Did he say when he'd return? Holmes asked, already scanning the corridor. No, sir. Said he might not come back at all. Gave me notice. Paid the rent up front through next week. Holmes gave a slight nod and stepped past him, uninvited but unhindered. The room was modest but tidy. A few shirts hung beside a brush and razor on the dresser. The bed was made, the window shut tight. But it was the writing desk that caught Holmes's attention. He moved to it immediately, lifting the lid. A blotter, a few spare pens, and a stack of heavy stock paper the same thickness and texture as the resignation letter. Holmes took one sheet and held it up to the light. "Identical watermark," he murmured. "So he did write it here." He knelt, opening the lower drawer. "Ah," he said softly. He withdrew a small envelope. Inside, a train schedule London to York. Yesterday's date circled in pencil. "But why Leeds?" I asked. "He's not from there, is he?" "No," Holmes replied, "which means the claim of family matters is likely a fiction. The destination is the clue. We must confirm if he boarded." As we left the building, Holmes was unusually quiet, his brows furrowed deeper than usual. It wasn't until we arrived at Scotland Yard and made inquiries that his silence bore fruit. Bexley, it seemed, had never arrived at the station. No ticket purchased. No witnesses who recalled seeing him board. He wanted to vanish, Holmes said as we exited the yard. But not by train, returning to Belgrave Square shortly before midday. We found the house buzzing with activity. Forensic men combed the room, though they were more inclined toward checking locks and examining footprints than anything subtle. Lestrade greeted us with a grimace and a shrug. Still no trace of Bexley. "The will's been located, though. Pembroke's estate goes almost entirely to his niece, Miss Clara Bexley, ironically, the butler's namesake, but no relation." Holmes's eyes lit up. "She's in residence. She is. Would you like to speak with her by wood?" We were shown to the drawing-room where Miss Clara Bexley sat stiff-backed on a settee, her dark dress immaculate, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was striking, but not in a conventional way. Her expression carried a weight, like a person who had long ago decided emotion was an extravagance. "I understand," she said as Holmes seated himself opposite her, "that you're here about my uncle." "I am," Holmes replied. "May I ask when you last saw him?" "Yesterday morning." He was in excellent spirits. He mentioned something about a private matter that needed tending and asked not to be disturbed. "That evening, I dined in my room." "Did you know Martin Bexley well?" "I did. He was always very kind to me as a child. A quiet man, loyal. I was shocked to learn he'd left us so abruptly. And yet," Holmes said slowly, "you do not seem especially alarmed that he left hours before your uncle was murdered." She paused, a flicker of something crossing her features, discomfort, perhaps, but quickly hidden. "I suppose I assumed he'd heard something troubling. My uncle had enemies." "Enemies?" Holmes leaned forward slightly. He was not an easy man. He often said things that might be construed as threats. I don't know if any of it was serious. Holmes studied her a moment longer, then rose. "One last question. Were you aware that something was removed from the study?" Her composure fractured only slightly. "Removed, yes. He was holding something, likely a letter or note. It's missing." She looked away. "I know nothing of it." As we stepped into the hall, Holmes stopped near a table under the staircase, his gaze fixed on a porcelain vase of lilies. He stared for a long moment, then, without warning, lifted the vase and turned it over. Nestled beneath was a small metallic Object, a button. Interesting, he said quietly. He turned it in his fingers. Not a servant's button. This one was gilded, finely detailed. A crest etched faintly onto the surface. A lion and 3 stars. Holmes pocketed it and whispered, "That crest is military." He turned to me with a sudden gleam in his eye. "Watson, do you recall Pembroke's military service? Brief, fought in the colonies, retired young." Holmes nodded. "He had enemies." "Yes, but not all of them are from England's drawing rooms. I suspect one of them is closer than anyone dares admit." We returned once more to the study. Holmes paced, restless, absorbing the room again with renewed purpose. "There is a discrepancy here," he muttered. "Something that doesn't align." He paused by the fireplace and stared at the grate. Then he crouched. "Watson, the ashes." I knelt beside him. "What about them? They are too fresh. Look closely, the logs are barely burnt. Yet this is summer. Why light a fire?" He reached in with the poker and stirred gently. Something blackened but solid clinked beneath the cinders. He pulled it out with the tongs. A small metal tin, charred around the edges. He opened it slowly. Inside, scraps of burnt paper, nearly illegible, but a few words still clung to life. "Bexley is aware. Blackmail." Clara Holmes stood, his expression grave. The letter he tried to write was not the first. He tried to burn the others, but failed, and he names not his butler, but his heir. Silence fell between us as the pieces began to realign. The resignation, the lie about Leeds, the faint tremor in Clara's voice when asked about the missing letter. Holmes turned sharply toward the door. She knew, or suspected. But did she act? He glanced at the button in his hand. "No," he whispered, "that part doesn't belong to her." And then his eyes lit with sudden clarity. "We must find the owner of this button. When we do, the shadow on this house will lift." The rain had stopped by the time we returned to No. 17 Belgrave Square, but the clouds hung low, heavy with something unfinished, much like the truth Holmes was circling ever closer. The button rested in his palm, its weight measured not in gold, but in implication. Lestrade met us at the door, his expression weary but sharpened with interest. Holmes wasted no time. "I need a list of all recent visitors to the house," he said, "particularly any affiliated with the military, officers, retired or otherwise. We've already spoken to the guests from the past week," Lestrade said. "Just the usual. One of Pembroke's solicitors, a fellow from the club named Fortescue, and a Major Blanchard old friend, I believe." Holmes's brow lifted. Major Blanchard, retired cavalryman, known Pembroke since the Afghanistan campaign, visited the evening before last. No indication he stayed. "Fetch him," Holmes said simply, while Lestrade dispatched a man to track Blanchard. Holmes returned to the drawing room where Miss Clara Bexley still sat. Though this time she was reading, or pretending to, she looked up without surprise. "I take it you found something new." "We have. But we seek clarity, not conclusions. Miss Bexley, would you be so good as to recount your movements yesterday evening?" She folded her hands again. "As I said, I dined in my room. Alone, yes, I had a headache. I took a tray and remained upstairs. And you saw no one, heard nothing, a pause. I heard a voice, my uncle, I believe, in the study. Was he speaking to someone? It sounded like it. The doors were closed. I didn't eavesdrop. Holmes tilted his head. And at what time was this? She hesitated, then said, perhaps around 8:30. But you heard no second voice, only his. Holmes's eyes narrowed faintly. Odd, don't you think? To converse alone, she shifted. He did that sometimes. He talked to himself, muttered. It unnerved the staff. Did it unnerve you occasionally? Holmes said nothing further, but the silence seemed to widen the space between them. He turned and left her to her fiction. Back in the study, the valet awaited us, a thin man named Harper, who looked as though he had been pressed into his suit by a vice. His eyes darted nervously each time Holmes moved. You were indisposed. Last night, Holmes said. Yes, sir. Migraine. It comes with a suddenness. I had to lie down. Yet the doctor says he only received your message this morning. Harper blinked. I didn't want to disturb him during the night. I thought rest would suffice. Did you see Lord Pembroke yesterday? Evenings, no, sir, only in passing. He was already in his study when I retired. You didn't notice the butler's departure? I was upstairs by then. I only learned of it from the maid this morning. Strange. Holmes said softly. How invisible the household becomes when questions arise. He turned abruptly. Bring in the cook. Mrs. Hensley entered with a suspicious frown and flour-dusted hands, her apron still tied at the waist. You prepared dinner last night? Yes. Miss Bexley took a tray upstairs. The rest of the staff ate separately. Did Lord Pembroke dine? No. He hadn't rung by 9, which was unusual. Sometimes he skipped meals, but he usually sent word. Did anyone else take a tray to him? She frowned. Not that I know of. No one entered the study, not while I was downstairs. Holmes steepled his fingers. Did Martin Bexley dine? No. He came to the kitchen, asked for cold meat and bread, said he was going out. I offered to heat something, but he refused. What time was this? Must have been near 7. He left around then. Did he appear disturbed? Mrs. Hensley's frown deepened. Now that you mention it, yes, he looked pale, hands shaking, not his usual self. I thought maybe he'd had bad news. Did he speak to Miss Bexley? No, not in front of me. Holmes dismissed her with a nod, then turned to Lestrade, who had just returned, a tall man with a silver mustache and polished boots in tow. Major Blanchard, Lestrade announced, claims he was away in Kent yesterday. Blanchard gave a curt nod. Bit of a surprise, all this. You were close to Lord Pembroke, from Sandhurst to retirement, Blanchard replied. He was a difficult man, but loyal. And when did you last see him? 2 nights ago. He called me here for a private word. May we ask what about? Blanchard hesitated, then said, he believes someone was blackmailing him. Wouldn't say who, but I gathered it was a family matter. Holmes said nothing for a moment, then removed the button from his pocket. Does this look familiar to you? Blanchard took it and turned it over. It's from the king's own yeomanry. Our old regimental dress. Haven't worn one of these in years. Lost one recently, not me. Haven't had that uniform out of the chest since my daughter's wedding. You were not here last night. I was in Sevenoaks. Spent the evening with my cousin. You're welcome to confirm it. Holmes inclined his head. I intend to. When Blanchard was gone, Holmes stood motionless for a long time, gazing once more at the button in his palm. One button, 3 stories, he murmured. Clara says she heard Pembroke speaking alone. The valet claims to have retired, but the doctor was only summoned today, and the butler, shaken, leaves hours before the death. And the cook, I added, claims Pembroke never rang for dinner, which contradicts his usual habits. Precisely, Holmes said. They each know something, and each is hiding something else. Clara hears no second voice, yet Pembroke's tone was engaged, reactive. That suggests someone was with him. Then someone lies, or several do. He turned to me with sharp eyes. Someone entered that study after Bexley left and before the maid discovered the body. Someone who took the paper from Pembroke's hand. Someone who burned the rest. And someone who now hopes that silence will hold fast. Holmes's eyes flicked to the grand staircase. Let us see if it does. As Holmes ascended the staircase, his gait slowed not from fatigue, but from thought. I had seen this rhythm before, a march not toward a place, but through a theory assembling itself in his mind. I followed in silence, aware that the house itself had begun to change. No longer merely the scene of a crime, it had become a crucible of human intent, each occupant casting shadows longer than their frame. We reached the upper landing, where the bedrooms branched off. Holmes stopped before Clara Bexley's door and knocked once. She answered promptly, still composed but without the studied calm she had earlier summoned. You've returned quickly, Mr. Holmes, as must any truth-seeker who feels a pattern shift beneath his feet. May we come in? She stepped aside. The room, like the woman, was elegant and restrained. A writing desk beneath the window bore no clutter, only a single fountain pen, a letter opener, and a glass of water untouched. I'd like to speak plainly, Holmes began. Because pretense only wastes time. Lord Pembroke believed he was being blackmailed. He told Major Blanchard so. A letter existed to that effect. It was burned. Though not completely, the ashes lie in the grate. Her lips parted, but no words came. Holmes continued. That letter mentioned your name. What? It said in full, I do not know. But your uncle believed you were in danger or implicated. A long silence followed. Then, very softly, she said, I didn't kill him. I have not accused you of that, Holmes said evenly. But you know something, Miss Bexley, something vital. She drew a breath. I believe someone found out what I'd been hiding. Holmes did not move, but his attention sharpened. I borrowed money, she said, not for gambling or vanity, for someone else. My mother's cousin, he was ill. The family would never have helped. I falsified a small signature in my uncle's name on one check, just once. But Bexley saw the ledger and confronted you. No, he was too decent for that. But I knew he knew, and I feared he might tell my uncle. Or worse, be blamed. Holmes was silent for a moment, then said, "And yet your uncle learned of it somehow." She looked down. "I think Bexley told him not to accuse me but to ask for leniency. Instead," Holmes murmured, "Pembroke prepared to disinherit you." She looked up, startled. "How do you know that?" "Because the will Lestrade found is unsigned. It names a new heir major, Blanchard's son, Jonathan. I saw the draft. Pembroke never finished it." Clara's face paled. "I didn't know." Holmes turned to the window, the glass reflecting a dim image of his own thoughts. "And yet the motive is not clear-cut. A forged check might shame you, but murder? That would not benefit you. It would leave the estate in disarray, and your uncle's solicitor would expose the signature discrepancy during probate. You are clever enough to know that." He turned sharply. "But someone else might not be. Someone like Harper," I offered. Holmes nodded. "Or someone loyal to Clara. Someone desperate to protect her." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Martin, he saw the ledger, saw the forgery, saw the unsigned will. Perhaps he warned your uncle and was rebuffed. Or perhaps more dangerously, someone else intercepted the warning." She blinked. "You think Martin tried to stop the will from being changed? Or tried to make sure it wasn't?" Holmes said. "He leaves a note, not of resignation, but of retreat. A man fleeing not from guilt, but from danger." She sat down slowly, the tension in her shoulders unwinding not in relief, but in the collapse of denial. "I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to help someone." Holmes gave a slight bow. Intentions rarely align with consequences. As we returned downstairs, Holmes spoke quickly and quietly. "The web tightens. Every thread connects to another. Clara's secret, Pembroke's shifting will, Bexley's silence, Blanchard's visit, and Harper. He is the only one without a visible motive, yet his actions scream concealment." In the study, Lestrade had been joined by a clerk from the solicitor's office, who held an envelope marked "private to be opened only upon my death." "It was in the safe," he said. "Only just unlocked it." Holmes took the envelope and opened it. Inside, a single letter. "If something happens to me, question the butler first. But do not trust appearances. My enemies were familiar faces." Signed, Elmer Pembroke. Lestrade frowned. So the butler was suspected. Holmes shook his head. No, Pembroke was not accusing Bexley. He was warning us that the butler would be the obvious scapegoat. Lestrade leaned forward. "Then who?" Holmes turned to the fireplace and stared into the cold ashes once more. He knelt again and pulled something further back with the poker beneath the grate itself. A second scrap of paper, more intact than the others. "Harper came in late. Told me Clara was unwell. Voice odd. Said I should sign the papers now." Holmes stood slowly, voice hardening. "Not Martin Bexley." He turned. "Harper?" Lestrade blinked. "The valet?" Holmes nodded. He had motive. To protect Clara, perhaps, or to frame Bexley and win her gratitude. He lied about the doctor, about retiring early, and he was seen coming from the study by none. Because he entered it without needing to be noticed. The fire was still warm. He burned the note, and the new will left the body as if undisturbed. Lestrade muttered, "And the button?" "Belongs to him," Holmes said, "or at least passed through his hands. Likely planted to direct suspicion elsewhere. He knew Pembroke had military contacts. It was a poor gambit, but one designed for speed." There was a knock on the door. Another constable entered. "We've found Bexley. He's in a lodging house near Clapham. Safe but terrified." Holmes turned to Lestrade. "Rest Harper, quietly, if he suspects. He may flee or harm someone else." Lestrade was already giving the order. Holmes crossed the study and closed the door behind him. He'd burned the future to protect a lie, he said, not for gain, but because he thought it would save her. "And Clara?" I asked. "She'll live with the truth unprosecuted." "Perhaps, but marked. And Bexley, he may be the only one who acted without deceit." As the clock in the hallway struck the hour, the last of the house's illusions seemed to fall away, leaving behind only silence and the weight of motive laid bare. The arrest was swift. Within the hour, Harper had been taken quietly from the house, his protestations mild but nervous, more confusion than denial. Lestrade, clearly pleased to have the matter nearly resolved, dusted his hands as if to say the entire business had been reduced to something manageable. A statement would be prepared, he assured us, one confirming the timely apprehension of the guilty party and praising Scotland Yard's efficiency. Holmes said nothing. In the parlour, Clara Bexley sat staring at her gloves, now clutched tightly, in her lap. When I entered to offer a few words of reassurance, she looked up, not hopeful, but hollow. "So that's it, then?" she asked. "It was Harper all along." "It seems," I said carefully, "that he may have acted in the belief that he was protecting you." She looked away, her jaw tight. "And instead, he's ruined his life. For nothing." Behind me, Holmes stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. There is always a temptation, Miss Bexley, to believe the case ends with an arrest. But endings, like motives, are rarely so simple. She met his gaze. "You think he's innocent?" Holmes didn't answer at once. "I think Harper may be guilty of something tampering, perhaps, or concealment, but not the full crime. The murder itself remains unsolved." Lestrade's voice called from the hallway. "Holmes, a word." We followed to the study, where Lestrade stood beside the desk, holding a folded envelope. "This was in Harper's coat," he said, "hidden inside the lining. Your butler, Bexley, wrote it." Holmes took the letter. "Read it quickly, then. Read it again more slowly." "Well?" I asked. He handed it to me without a word. "To whom it may concern, if anything happens to Lord Pembroke, I must speak. Miss Clara has done nothing deserving of scandal. She only wished to help her family. I did show the ledger to his lordship. He was furious at first, but calmed after our talk. I believe he intended to make peace. I was instructed to leave, not because of punishment, but because he feared what others might do to silence the matter. If I vanish, look beyond the obvious. This house keeps secrets." Bexley Lestrade exhaled sharply. So Harper knew about this note. That makes him look worse, doesn't it? Holmes was already walking the perimeter of the study. It makes him look frightened. But it also raises a more troubling question. If Lord Pembroke had resolved to forgive Clara, why then was the will changed? Why begin a new draft disinheriting her? Lestrade frowned. Maybe he changed his mind again. No, Holmes said softly, eyes narrowing. Pembroke's character was prideful. Yes, but also methodical. He would not burn evidence of reconciliation only to restart a conflict, which means someone else wanted Clara out of the will. Someone who ensured that the old man never got to sign the new one, and that no record of forgiveness would remain. He looked up suddenly. Where is Blanchard? Lestrade blinked. We released him after confirming his alibi. His cousin vouched for him. Why? Holmes's eyes had gone distant. Because he had motive, didn't he? His son stood to inherit if Clara was removed. And he was in the house tonight before the murder. Plenty of time to plant the button. Observe the butler and perhaps discover Pembroke's intention. But you saw the letter, Lestrade said. Pembroke was suspicious of the butler, not the major. And that's precisely what troubles me. Holmes replied. Why leave such a letter in a safe rather than speak plainly? Pembroke knew he was under threat, yet he took no visible action. Unless he didn't realize who the real threat was. At that moment, a constable stepped in with a box. Sir, we've brought in the rest of Harper's belongings. There's something odd in here. Holmes opened the box, removed a small envelope, and sniffed it. Then he unfolded the note inside. His brow darkened. This ink, he murmured, is the same as the ink on the unsigned will draft. But this letter is a forgery. He held it up. This is a clumsy attempt to paint Harper as acting alone. It names him directly, quotes the forged confession, even refers to Clara's guilt in detail. Too much detail. It reads not like the words of a man burdened by truth, but like one building a case. Lestrade crossed his arms. So you think someone planted it in Harper's things? I think someone wanted Harper caught, and quickly. Someone who believed that the arrest would bring an end to scrutiny. Blanchard? Holmes shook his head. Possibly. But there's someone we haven't spoken to again. Someone who knew the movements of everyone in this house when Clara dined alone, when Bexley left. When the study was likely unguarded, the maid, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. Bring her to me. When Miss Fletcher was shown in, her apron was clean, her eyes slightly red-rimmed, but she stood with the posture of one who had told her story and expected no further questions. Holmes gestured to a chair. You found the body, did you not? Yes, sir. You unlocked the door yourself, yes. With the second key. Who gave you that key? She blinked. No one, sir. I knew where it was kept in the cabinet in the hall. And when was the last time you saw Harper yesterday? She hesitated. Early evening. Around 7. He looked pale. Did you speak? Only briefly. I asked if he needed anything. He said no. Holmes stared at her. And you're certain you saw no one enter or leave the study that night? A pause. No one, sir. Holmes glanced at me. Watson. If you were to murder a man in a locked room and wished to leave no trace, how would you do it? With poison, I said, or some substance delayed in effect. Holmes nodded. A glass of brandy, not smashed in a struggle, but knocked over in a seizure, and the bruise on the temple, not from a blow, but from falling forward. He turned back to the maid, who poured Lord Pembroke's brandy. She swallowed. He always poured it himself, except when someone else offered. As a gesture, as a kindness, she said nothing. Holmes stepped forward. You knew the study's routine. The fire was already set. You knew the desk would be open. You also knew Bexley had gone. Harper was ill. The moment was perfect. No, she whispered. I didn't mean to. He wasn't supposed to drink it. Holmes's voice lowered. But he did. And when he collapsed, you had to make it appear clean. You relocked the window with the sliver. You burned the letters, and you left the room as if it had never been touched. Lestrade stared at her. Why? Miss Fletcher, why do all this? She burst into tears. Because he was going to ruin Miss Clara. He said she was a disgrace. He called her a thief. He said he'd see her penniless. She was good to me. Always good. She didn't deserve it. Holmes sighed, almost sadly. So you gave him peace, a quiet death. But you made it look like someone else's crime. As Lestrade took the maid away, Holmes turned to me. A false victory is always the most dangerous kind. It lulls everyone into stillness just before the real answer steps out from behind the curtain. And now? I asked. Now, Holmes said, the curtain is open. The storm that had threatened all morning finally broke as Holmes and I stepped outside. A slow, deliberate rain coated the city in silence, each drop whispering secrets the house behind us had struggled to contain. The maid's confession had tied off one thread, and yet Holmes's face bore none of the satisfaction a solved mystery might bring. She's not the architect, he said flatly. She's the final act performed out of loyalty, perhaps love, but not ambition. I pulled my coat tighter. Then who is? That, he said, is precisely what I intend to discover. Back at Baker Street, the familiar comfort of our sitting room welcomed us with warmth, but Holmes did not pause. He crossed directly to the files near the bookshelf, an unassuming drawer labeled EH, and pulled out an old, weathered casebook. A death like Lord Pembroke's, he murmured. Flipping pages with swift precision does not spring from a single quarrel or an impulsive fit. It is a consequence, and consequences are born of history. I leaned forward. You suspect a deeper connection, not suspect. No. He stopped at a file. Its paper brittle with time. The name across the top caught my breath. Elmer Pembroke Inquiry, 1879 Cobble. A military tribunal? I asked. Worse, Holmes replied. A cover-up. He spread the file open. Faded ink told a harrowing story. During his deployment in Afghanistan, Lord Pembroke had overseen a controversial inquiry into a stolen military payroll. 3 officers were accused to dishonorably discharged. The third, a young lieutenant, had vanished under a cloud of suspicion and disgrace. His name was Jonathan Blanchard. Holmes tapped the name. the son of Major Blanchard. But that makes no sense, I said. Jonathan would have been too young. He was barely of age at the time. His career ended before it began. Thanks to Pembroke, the scandal was quietly buried, but the consequences are now rising. I sat back, and now the Major's son stands to inherit Pembroke's estate. Only if Clara is removed, Holmes said grimly, and that effort began long before the will. He pulled a second folder more recent. Letters, not addressed to Pembroke, but intercepted from his solicitor's assistant. One caught Holmes's attention. This was forwarded to Pembroke's house by mistake, he said. A letter addressed to Major Blanchard, but redirected. Dated 3 weeks before the murder. I read it aloud. Lord Pembroke is growing more forgetful. He's begun dictating conflicting instructions. We may need to revisit the question of heirs if clarity is not restored. It sounds like nothing more than a legal concern, I offered. On the surface, Holmes agreed. But taken with everything else, it reveals intent. The Major had advance notice that Pembroke's mental faculties were faltering. A perfect time to exert influence, forge a draft, or perhaps mislead a loyal servant. The rain beat harder against the window as Holmes stood, eyes narrowed. And there's something else. What? He didn't answer at once. Instead, he walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed the button, the same crest we had seen days ago. When it first pointed away from the butler, Holmes examined it again under a magnifier, then handed it to me. Notice anything unusual? I looked closely. The gold was worn along the edges, the engraving slightly dulled. It's older than I thought, I said, worn down. Holmes nodded. That button predates the current king's own yeomanry uniform. It belongs to a design phased out more than 20 years ago. So, Holmes said. It was not dropped recently. It's an heirloom. And only one person in this case has a reason to carry old military ornaments, like talismans. He opened a small book of regimental histories and pointed to a group photo. Major Blanchard stood tall in the center, his son beside him in younger years, proud and stiff in ill-fitting dress uniform. On his chest 3 buttons, one gleaming to warn the missing third. Holmes said. Blanchard has been keeping it until he used it to frame someone, to confuse everyone. I felt the chill then, not from the rain, but from understanding. But why now, after all these years? Because Pembroke was rewriting history, Holmes said, revising his will, erasing Jonathan from his thoughts. Just as he had from the army's records. Blanchard couldn't allow that. This wasn't about revenge. It was about legacy, restoration. A son's name vindicated not by trial, but by inheritance. And Clara, she was the only obstacle left, so she had to be compromised, quietly, irrevocably. But why involve the maid? I believe he didn't. She acted independently out of fear, confusion. Blanchard's plan was more delicate. Poison the brandy, let time create doubt, and remove the real draft before Pembroke could sign. But when the maid entered too soon, everything shifted. I exhaled. So the murder was born of one plot and buried under another. Holmes nodded, as so often it is. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade, soaked and breathless, entered with a telegram in hand. "We just got word," he said. "Blanchard's son Jonathan booked passage to Lisbon yesterday. Used a false name. Holmes took the paper. So the son flees while the father watches the estate transfer into his hands. I trust you still have the Major under surveillance," had Lestrade admitted. "He left his club this morning. We lost him near the Strand." Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "Then we haven't much time." Outside, the rain had tapered to a mist, as if London herself were holding her breath. Somewhere in the fog, a man waited not out of guilt, but calculation. He had almost succeeded. He had let others take the fall, orchestrated confusion, buried the past beneath a respectable uniform and a slow-burning grudge. But Holmes, as ever, had been watching the shadows, and the past, no matter how long buried, had begun to speak. Holmes moved through the city like a hound just downwind of its quarry, alert, silent, utterly focused. The fog along the Strand rolled in thick ribbons, washing over the cobblestones and blurring the carriages into shadowy phantoms. Somewhere in that shifting veil, Major Blanchard was hiding not from justice in the formal sense, but from confrontation. That, Holmes knew, would be the only method by which the man might falter. We circled Westminster twice before Holmes made his decision. He led us not to a lodging house or club, but to a discreet little café tucked behind the arches near Covent Garden. It was not the sort of place a retired officer would frequent, but Holmes knew something I did not. As we stepped inside, Holmes scanned the room. There, seated in a high-backed chair at the corner table, his mustache twitching ever so slightly, was Blanchard. He was alone, reading a folded newspaper with the rigidity of someone pretending not to wait. Holmes approached with the deliberate calm of a man unbothered by the notion of politeness. He sat without invitation. "Good morning, Major." Blanchard looked up slowly. His smile was strained. "Mr. Holmes, a surprise. And your shadow, of course," he added, nodding toward me. "You're difficult to find when you don't wish to be," Holmes said mildly. "Or perhaps you were looking in the wrong places." "No," Holmes said. "I was just waiting for you to feel safe." The tension between them was palpable. Blanchard's fingers tapped once on the table. "Then, I suppose you've come to arrest me?" "No, that's Lestrade's job. I've come to confirm something." Holmes pulled something from his coat small, wrapped in a cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, a glass tumbler. Its base glinted under the cafe's low light. "Lord Pembroke's study tumbler," he said. "The one you insisted you never touched. But the smudge beneath the base. Oil from a particular pomade military issue, discontinued years ago. Only one man in that house wore it, and only one guest sat across from Pembroke recently enough to leave it behind." Blanchard's mouth opened, then closed. "I imagine you lifted the glass before it fell." Holmes continued, and placed it back in position to suggest nothing had passed between you. But the print was partial. A chemical lift showed the swirl of soldier's callus, circumstantial. Blanchard muttered. Holmes leaned closer. "Quite. Which is why I'm not here with charges. I'm here with a test." At this, Blanchard blinked. "A test? Yes, Holmes said, reaching into his inner pocket again. He removed a sealed envelope, blank but clearly official. A letter from the War Office regarding a retroactive review of dismissed commissions from the Afghanistan campaign in light of new testimony. Blanchard straightened, the mask slipping ever so slightly. New testimony? Holmes smiled thinly. If your son was wrongly accused, he may yet be cleared. Restored honorably, of course. We'll need your cooperation. Every detail of Pembroke's conduct. Every word he spoke. There was a pause. The cafe seemed to grow quieter. And if I refuse, Blanchard said slowly, then this letter is never opened. Your son remains a ghost in army records. And Clara Bexley inherits everything. Blanchard's knuckles tightened against the edge of the table. But that's not what you want, is it? Holmes said softly. You don't care about the estate. You care about vindication. You want your son's name etched back into the ranks, free of shame. That's why you waited so long. That's why you could endure disgrace for him. But you made a critical mistake, Major. Blanchard said nothing. You assumed Pembroke would never change his mind. That Clara had already supplanted your family. But Pembroke was reconciling. He began to forgive. Not just Clara, even your son. He was reviewing that old case, wasn't he? Preparing to admit his error. Blanchard's voice was low and hoarse. He said Jonathan was weak. That a weak man in uniform was more dangerous than a traitor. And you believed he'd destroy your son again. Blanchard nodded slowly. He said he would speak to the board. He said Jonathan would never wear a uniform again, not even in memory. Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then, so you acted. I never meant for it to happen that way, Blanchard muttered. I only wanted the will unsigned. The maid's interference ruined everything. She panicked. And I let it unfold. You poisoned the brandy. I laced it with a mild cardiac agent, something to cause a collapse, nothing fatal, at worst. I hoped it would delay the signing. But when I returned later, he was dead, and someone had cleaned the scene. Holmes looked at me, then back to Blanchard. You left the button to send me in the wrong direction. I panicked. And Harper? I asked. I never intended for him to be arrested. But when it happened, I didn't stop it. I thought, perhaps the truth wouldn't matter. Holmes stood, folding the cloth around the glass once more. It always matters, Major, and it tends to return no matter how deep you bury it. Blanchard remained seated, but his eyes followed Holmes as we turned to leave. Outside, the rain had finally ceased. The streets shimmered under a pale sunlight struggling to reassert itself. Holmes walked in silence for several paces before speaking. It's the smallest things, Watson. A fingerprint under glass. A reaction to a lie disguised as hope. I nodded, and the letter, blank, of course. But the way he leaned forward hungry for it was everything. Truth, you see, is a lever. And today, we found the right fulcrum. As we turned the corner, Holmes glanced back once toward the cafe. The game is nearly over, he said. All that remains now is the checkmate. The day after our encounter with Major Blanchard began with quiet optimism. Holmes had arranged to meet Lestrade to formalize charges and begin the slow, delicate task of corroborating the confession. Blanchard, though not in custody, had agreed to remain in London for questioning. The pieces, at last, were aligning. But as we reached Baker Street that morning, a telegram awaited us short, unsigned, and unsettling. Solicitor's office burgled overnight. Will draft missing. No other documents touched. Advise immediately. Holmes read it thrice without speaking. His knuckles whitened as he folded the paper neatly and placed it on the mantel. Now the game begins in earnest, he said. We made haste. To the chambers of Pembroke's solicitor, a Mr. Ellery, a man of advanced age and habitually skeptical eyebrows. He met us at the door with visible agitation and led us into the records room, where rows of mahogany drawers held decades of legal history. They knew what they were after. Ellery said only one drawer disturbed Pembroke's, but they didn't rifle through everything. They opened it, pulled the will draft, and left the rest untouched. Time of entry? Holmes asked. Sometime between 2 and for this morning. No signs of forced entry. We suspect a duplicate key. Holmes turned slowly in the narrow space, eyes roaming over ceiling, floor, hinges. Corners seeking not what had been taken, but how. This office is guarded, Ellery nodded. Security downstairs, but they were called away false alarm. A fire reported to buildings down. Nothing there when they arrived. Holmes's jaw tightened. Orchestrated. Yes, Ellery agreed grimly. And effective. I studied Holmes's expression. He was not surprised, only furious. That draft, I said, was the only physical evidence of Pembroke's intent to change his will. More than that, Holmes said, it was the last tether to motive. Without it, we cannot demonstrate that Blanchard's scheme had a goal. Surely Clara knows what she suspected. But suspicions do not withstand courts. We returned to Baker Street in a kind of unsettled silence. Holmes threw himself into motion, leafing through papers, telegrams, transcripts of interviews. The energy had returned to him, sharp and relentless, but it was not confidence. It was resolve edging toward desperation. By late afternoon, the door knocker startled us both. Lestrade entered, grim. I've just come from the club. Blanchard is gone. Holmes did not look up. Gone where? No forwarding address. Room cleared out this morning. He paid in cash, left no trace. Holmes rose slowly. He didn't flee. He prepared. I've issued an alert, Lestrade said. But there's no evidence we can pin on him now. Not without the will. Holmes stared at the fire, where shadows danced like ghosts across the hearth. Then, we must assume, he said softly, that he has accomplices. Lestrade frowned. You mean Harper? Holmes shook his head. No, Harper was a pawn. So was the maid. Blanchard's accomplice is still free and far more clever. Someone with access to the solicitor's schedule. Someone with keys. Someone watching every step of the investigation, waiting for the moment to strike. Who, then? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Someone close to close. Someone we never suspected. That evening, we returned to Pembroke's estate not to interrogate, but to observe. Clara greeted us with quiet tension. Her eyes, still rimmed with sorrow, flicked between us as she led us once again to the study. It felt colder now, the air heavier. "I hoped you were here with news," she said, in a sense. Holmes replied, "The draft of the will has been stolen." She stopped. "What? But how?" "We believe it was deliberate. An effort to sever the final link between motive and suspect." She paced to the window, her voice low. "Then nothing can be proved." Holmes stepped closer. "Tell me again about the week before your uncle's death. Was there anyone who began appearing more often than usual? Anyone whose presence seemed newly convenient?" She hesitated. "Well, there was Mr. Ellery's assistant, Mr. Finch. He came by the house twice, said Uncle needed to sign something." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "What did he take with him?" "Envelopes. Sealed. I assumed they were drafts." Holmes turned. "Describe him." "About your height. Blonde hair. Neat. Quiet." Holmes nodded. "That is not Mr. Finch." "What?" "Mr. Finch is a short, dark-haired man with a limp. He has never been to this house." "The man you saw was someone else." Clara paled. "Then, who a forger?" Holmes said. "A spy. And someone very careful. This man knew Pembroke's schedule. He posed as the solicitor's agent, accessed the drawer, took the draft, and he froze. The handwriting, he whispered. What's in the forged letter blaming Harper? It mimicked Pembroke's style, but I dismissed it. I shouldn't have. I stepped forward. You think it was done by the same hand? Holmes nodded. Finely trained, legally skilled. But one mistake. One detail he could not fake. He left abruptly, dragging us behind him down the stairs and through the fog once more. Within the hour, we stood again in Mr. Ellery's office. Holmes demanded the full employment record of every clerk, every temp, every messenger who had handled Pembroke's affairs. In the last 6 months, at the bottom of the list, Andrew Cutter, temporary filing clerk, released 6 weeks ago. No forwarding address. Holmes tapped the name. That's him. He was Blanchard's knife in the dark. Lestrade stepped forward, and he has the will, if he does. It's either destroyed or stashed for blackmail. Holmes stared hard at the name. He's not done. Men like Cutter don't work for others forever. They wait for their own advantage. And now, the truth is vanishing piece by piece. A silence settled, as heavy as the fog outside. Holmes looked up, eyes steeled. We cannot let it vanish entirely. Night returned with a strange stillness. Even the gas lights outside Baker Street burned low, as if the city itself sensed a coming rupture. Holmes stood at the window, fingers laced behind his back, his silhouette hard against the pane. He had spoken very little since identifying Andrew Cutter. The man was a phantom now, his name, his trail, his purpose all slipping like fog through grasping fingers. It was just past midnight when the knock came. A constable stood breathless at the door, hat in hand, cheeks pale. There's been another incident, he said. Clara Bexley has vanished. Within half an hour, we stood again in the echoing halls of Pembroke's estate. The air inside was different, sharpened, disturbed. The maid, her eyes wide with fear, led us to Clara's room. Her bed was untouched, a shawl still hung from the post, but her case was missing. No sign of struggle, no note. Only the window stood slightly ajar, letting in the cold bite of the night. She left nothing. Holmes asked. The maid shook her head. She was quiet all evening. Sir said she needed rest. I brought up her tea just past 9. That was the last I saw her. Holmes examined the window latch, the sill, the narrow balcony outside. His face remained blank, but I saw it the ripple beneath the stillness. Would she run? I asked. She wouldn't, he replied. Not unless forced. He turned to the hearth. The ashes in the fireplace were recent less than an hour. Cold, kneeling, Holmes used the tongs to retrieve something unburnt at the edge. It was the corner of a paper. The edge was scorched, but legible. Should never have trusted them. If you read this, it's already too late. He folded the scrap. Gently. Whoever took her knew we were close. Cutter's panic is growing. Lestrade arrived moments later, summoned by telegram, accompanied by 2 men and a rising wave of confusion. Another disappearance, he said. Scanning the room, she left willingly. No. Holmes said she was taken or tricked, possibly both. She could be halfway to Dover. Holmes shook his head. No, this wasn't about escape. It was about silence. We scoured the estate until first light, but there were no signs, no sightings, no horses taken, not even the groundskeeper had heard a thing. It was as though Clara had vanished into smoke. But Holmes was not finished. As dawn broke, he led us wordlessly to Pembroke's study. Everything inside remained untouched, except the desk drawer, which Holmes opened with a key I hadn't seen before. Inside, neatly folded beneath several letters, was a small red notebook. Holmes opened it slowly. Pembroke's diary, he said. I suspected it existed. He would never trust only letters. The final entries were brief, clipped more bullet points than musings. Clara told me about the false solicitor. Notified. Ellery told him to verify staff identities. Blanchard called unexpectedly, claimed ignorance. Feel I am being watched. Will change draft location tomorrow. Holmes closed the book. He hid the true draft. Cutter never got it. He stole. A decoy. And now he fears it might surface. I said, so he's eliminating anyone who might know where it is. Exactly. A knock came again. This time, a telegram. Holmes opened it quickly, and his face changed. It's from Clara. We gathered around as he read, alive, held outside London. Do not trust Ellery. Cutter is not alone. They want the real will. They think I know where it is. I don't. Please hurry. Holmes read it again, slower this time, then lowered the page. She's alive. That means they need her. They're not done. Lestrade was already barking orders, calling for every constable within range. Holmes stood, motionless a moment, then turned to me. Watson, we are nearly at the end. But the board has shifted. What do you mean? He looked toward the door, the fireplace, the empty window. I believed Blanchard was the end of the thread. But there is someone else, someone more dangerous. Who? Holmes's eyes met mine sharper now, colder. Someone with reach, someone who knew the will existed, knew Pembroke's doubts, and feared what exposure might bring. Cutter was the agent, but the benefactor may have worn a friend's mask. At that moment, a loud shout echoed from the corridor. A constable stumbled in, face ashen. "Sir, Mr. Ellery's office. Fire. Just now. Everything gone." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. That's the second piece of evidence wiped out. I understood then. Clara taken, the will destroyed, records buried. Each thread Holmes had traced was being severed by an invisible blade, always a step ahead. And somewhere behind that blade stood a mind cautious, cruel, calculating. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You must protect every person connected to Pembroke. We don't know who's next." "And you?" Holmes said, already striding for the door. "I am going to find the last move they haven't accounted for." "But how?" He paused only once. "Because I'm going to force their hand." Then he vanished into the dawn, chasing the vanishing trail of a ghost whose next move might strike in blood. The streets of London, washed clean by a cold morning rain, seemed to glisten with withheld secrets. Holmes returned to Baker Street just after 9, his coat slick with damp and his expression unreadable. He brushed past me without a word, collapsing into the armchair, as though struck by some invisible weight. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Watson, how often does a man write a false will and hide it so perfectly, only to speak of it in passing?" I sat across from him, uncertain. "You mean Pembroke?" He nodded. The diary noted a change of location. But if the real draft was moved, where? Cutter clearly never found it. Then it must still be hidden somewhere on the estate. "No," he said, tapping his fingers against the chair's arm. "They've torn the estate apart before, and after Pembroke's death. If it were hidden in the study, or behind a drawer, or beneath a floorboard, Cutter would have found it. Then what are we missing?" Holmes stood, went to his desk, and retrieved the charred paper we had recovered from Clara's fireplace. He flattened it beside Pembroke's diary and pointed to the smudged edge of the note. "The ink here," he said. "Do you see it? It was faint," but I nodded. "A blot from a different pen. Pembroke's ink was iron gold. This is different. This came from Clara's own hand." He reached again into his drawer and retrieved the original note. Clara had scribbled to Holmes weeks earlier. The paper was the same. The ink matched. Holmes's gaze turned distant, his voice softening. "She burned it not because it was dangerous, but because it meant something. Something she thought we wouldn't understand." He tapped the final line. "If you read this, it's already too late. She wasn't just frightened. She was resigned. But what would make her think it was too late?" Holmes turned suddenly and crossed the room to his violin case, not to play, but to open the drawer beneath it. From within, he retrieved a small envelope one I recognized. It contained a photograph we'd found weeks ago, discarded among Pembroke's letters, a faded image of a woman standing in a conservatory, surrounded by flowering vines. "Clara's mother," Holmes murmured. "She died in this house." I frowned. "I thought she passed during Clara's childhood." "She did. And yet he said, holding the photo up to the light. "This conservatory no longer exists." I sat up. "Are you saying it was torn down when Pembroke renovated the West Wing? But this photograph is recent enough to show detailed furniture, patterns, even books stacked in the background." He reached again into the diary, flipping to an earlier page. There, in a list of repairs and construction notes, was a brief entry. "Old. Conservatory doors sealed, not removed." Holmes turned to me, and I saw the glint return to his eyes. "They sealed the room, Watson, not demolished it, and Pembroke left something behind. Within an hour, we were back at the estate, this time with the groundskeeper in tow." Holmes led us to a narrow corridor behind the study that terminated in a windowless wall. Dust cloaked the floor, but Holmes traced his hand along the paneling until it caught against a hairline seam. "Here," he said, with a borrowed crowbar and steady hands, we pried it open. The wood gave way with a reluctant groan, revealing a hidden door rotted, but intact. Inside lay a forgotten space, overgrown with ivy curling in from a shattered skylight. Its floor warped and cracked. The air was musty with earth and age. But amid the debris stood a single desk. On it, untouched by time, was a sealed envelope with Pembroke's crest. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a folded will signed, dated, witnessed, and clearly naming Clara Bexley as sole beneficiary. "No forgeries," Holmes said, voice quiet. "No confusion. This is the truth he wanted buried with the past." But even as he spoke, something in his expression darkened. He turned the envelope over and removed a second sheet handwritten. Not legal. It was a letter, addressed not to Clara, but to Andrew Cutter. "You may twist what you like, but this document remains untouched. If anything happens to her, all shall be made public. You think me senile, but I remember too much. You will not win." P. Holmes looked up slowly. He knew Cutter, knew who he was. "You mean, not just some hired agent?" "Not at all. Pembroke knew him from the War Office. Cutter had been an assistant clerk during the tribunal that ruined Jonathan Blanchard. He was not acting on Blanchard's orders, he was manipulating them both. But for what purpose? To eliminate all traces. Cutter was cleaning the record, with Clara's inheritance out of the way, and the will destroyed. No one would ever question the legitimacy of Pembroke's estate. Cutter could sell the secrets to the highest bidder or bury them forever. The pieces slid into place like clockwork. The pattern emerged not just in the actions, but in the omissions. Cutter had allowed suspicion to fall on Blanchard. He had faked the solicitor's assistant role. He had orchestrated Clara's abduction. And he had nearly destroyed every fragment of truth linking him to Pembroke's final decision. Holmes stepped out of the ruined conservatory, the will in hand, his expression unreadable once more. "We have our proof," I said quietly. "No," he replied. "We have our weapon. Now we find the man hiding behind the smoke." The moment Holmes and I left the overgrown conservatory, the weight of the hidden will pressed heavily on us, less as a triumph and more as a portent. The discovery should have been the turning point, but the deeper we sank into the case, the more it became clear that this was only the surface of a far darker truth. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the will and Pembroke's final letter across the table, staring long into the ink as if trying to draw the man's spirit from the words. His voice, when it came, was low and measured. This is no mere dispute over inheritance, Watson. The story beneath these pages is tangled with something far less tangible, something that binds each player in this tragedy beyond greed or revenge. I leaned forward. You mean there's another motive? Holmes's gaze lifted, piercing. Yes, and it is rooted in the past deeper than any ledger or property deed. I believe it has to do with loyalty and betrayal. He recounted what we knew of Major Blanchard's son, Jonathan, a promising officer disgraced by accusations during the Afghanistan campaign. The boy's fall had fractured his family. Blanchard had waited years, nursing bitterness, a silent fury. But what of Pembroke, the man who presided over the tribunal, the one who had condemned Jonathan? Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. Pembroke was not simply a judge. He was a man haunted by conscience. The diary hints at this. He saw faults in his decision, suspected miscarriage of justice, and hoped to make amends through his will. But Blanchard's actions, I began. Desperation, Holmes said sharply. He feared not only the loss of fortune, but the unraveling of his son's reputation. To Blanchard, this was not about money, it was about redemption, and he was willing to walk through fire to claim it. Holmes's eyes glinted with a hint of melancholy, yet even that is incomplete. I frowned. What else could drive a man to such extremes? Holmes stood and moved to the window, gazing out over London's sprawling grey. Consider this, Watson. I have spoken often of human nature's complexity, but some men are consumed by an obsession not with power or wealth, but with control over narrative itself. Blanchard's fury was not only for his son's name, but for the story, the version of truth that would live after them. He turned back to the table, lifting the letter addressed to Cutter. This letter reveals Pembroke's fear that his own past the tribunals, the decisions, the men destroyed would come to light. He believed Cutter was a man capable of silencing those truths permanently. Holmes's fingers traced the ink with reverence. Cutter, then, was not just a hired hand. He was the executor of silence. His mission, not merely theft or forgery, but the erasure of inconvenient truths. I looked at Holmes, the implications dawning slowly. You mean the crime was to protect secrets far more damning than an inheritance dispute? Holmes nodded. Precisely. The documents Pembroke feared to lose were not only his will, but records that could expose decades-old corruption within the War Office, corruption that had destroyed countless careers, including Jonathan Blanchard's. But if Cutter was protecting those secrets, why abduct Clara? Why the violence? Because Clara, whether knowingly or not, held a piece of that story. She was Pembroke's heir. Yes, but also the keeper of his conscience. She threatened to expose the truth by bringing the will and its hidden messages to light. Holmes paused, the room heavy with the gravity of his revelation. Each act of destruction, each vanished document, every shadow cast over this case was a calculated move to preserve a lie so vast it would topple reputations and lives if revealed. I rubbed my chin. So the villain isn't just Cutter or Blanchard. It's the system they served, the silent pact of men who bury inconvenient truths for the sake of their own survival. Holmes's eyes gleamed with an eerie satisfaction. And therein lies the true horror. The crime was never just about Pembroke's death. It was about legacy, a legacy protected at any cost, even murder. Just then, the door opened quietly. Lestrade entered, holding a telegram and a grim expression. There's been an attempted break-in at the War Office archives. Papers destroyed. A clerk badly beaten. Holmes barely blinked. They are fighting to keep the past buried, Watson. But the deeper they dig, the more desperate they become. He stepped closer, voice firm and resolute. Our task is no longer merely to solve a murder. It is to unearth a conspiracy that has festered in silence for too long, and to ensure that justice is not only done but seen to be done. I nodded, understanding fully now that the case was far more than it had seemed at first, a sprawling web of secrets, betrayal, and a desperate human need to control the stories we tell ourselves about honor and truth. Holmes gathered the letters and notes, eyes burning with renewed purpose. The truth will out, Watson. But first, we must expose the men who would kill to keep it hidden. The evening had fallen thick and heavy by the time, Holmes and I made our way back to Pembroke's estate. The fog rolled in like a living thing, curling through the leafless branches and choking the winding gravel paths. Holmes's pace was steady, deliberate, his mind racing beneath the calm exterior. Tonight, he had said, would be decisive. Lestrade was already there, coordinating with a small contingent of officers quietly stationed around the manor, their lanterns casting flickering pools of light. Holmes had summoned them for this moment, not for a straightforward arrest, but for a careful trap designed to draw the shadow out of hiding. We know the will exists, Holmes explained, addressing the assembled men. And we know Cutter is desperate to secure its destruction. But he believes Clara is still in their hands. We will use this to our advantage. I glanced toward the windows of the dimly lit drawing room where Clara had been held, now empty, but filled with the echoes of recent fear. Holmes motioned for silence and directed Lestrade to have a trusted officer pose as a courier, delivering a falsified letter to Cutter's known contacts. The letter suggested that Clara would be moved tonight, that the real will was still unrecovered, and that Cutter's benefactors were losing patience. The bait, Holmes said quietly. They will come for the will, or for her, and we will be waiting. As the hours dragged on, the estate seemed to hold its breath. Even the dogs in the kennels were silent. Holmes and I stationed ourselves in the shadowed corridor outside the study where the hidden conservatory door had been found. Patience, Watson, Holmes whispered, barely audible. Near midnight, the first sign arrived, a faint creak from the servants' entrance, followed by the muffled tread of footsteps. A figure slipped through the dark, cautious, moving toward the study. Holmes's fingers tightened around his revolver, but he made no sound. I barely dared to breathe. The man was thin, his coat torn at the cuff, eyes darting nervously. Cutter, Holmes, stepped from the shadows and blocked the path. Mr. Cutter, I presume. Cutter froze, then laughed bitterly. Holmes, so the great detective finally tracks me to my den. Holmes's voice was calm, almost gentle. It's over. The will is safe. Clara is free. Your attempts to erase the past have failed. Cutter's smile twisted into something colder. You think you've won. You don't understand. This isn't about paper and signatures. It's about power, the power to control the story, to dictate what is remembered and what is forgotten. Pembroke's secrets aren't just files. They are lives, futures. He stepped forward, eyes flashing dangerously. Holmes's gaze never wavered. And yet you gambled on murder and blackmail. Tell me, Cutter, did you think you could outrun the truth? Cutter's hand moved suddenly, reaching into his coat pocket. Holmes reacted instantly, firing a warning shot into the floor. Cutter stopped, hands raised. Last chance, Holmes said firmly. Cutter's shoulders sagged. Fine. You want the truth. Pembroke was haunted by the tribunal's injustice. I was his enforcer, sent to bury inconvenient evidence. But I did more. I took it upon myself to protect his legacy, to protect my place in it. Holmes stepped closer. So you killed to protect a lie. I killed to protect what little honor remained. But Pembroke's past was poison. It destroyed Jonathan Blanchard, and now it threatens us all. Holmes motioned to Lestrade, who stepped forward to cuff Cutter. As for Clara, Cutter added, voice cracking, she was collateral. She knew too much. But I couldn't let her speak. Holmes looked at me, then back at Cutter, and yet here she is alive and ready to tell the story. The legacy you tried to bury is now your undoing. Outside, the fog lifted as if released by the weight of truth. Holmes's eyes softened, the tension finally easing. Watson, he said quietly, the tangled webs men weave are rarely as secure as they imagine. It takes only one thread to unravel the whole, and with Cutter's arrest, the long nights. Shadow finally receded, leaving justice, fragile but unyielding, to take its place. The dawn light filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of Baker Street as Holmes sat at his desk, poring once again over the scattered documents we had recovered. The arrest of Cutter seemed to close the chapter on this grim affair. Yet, beneath the surface of resolution, Holmes's restless gaze betrayed a mind still at war. I ventured cautiously, you seem troubled, Holmes. Cutter's confession was thorough. The case is all but closed. Holmes shook his head, eyes flickering toward a small envelope sealed with crimson wax that lay atop the pile. No, Watson, the confession was convenient but not complete. There is one last thread, one shadow yet unaccounted for. I leaned closer. You suspect another hand behind the curtain. Holmes's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. Precisely. Cutter was but a pawn, and I fear the true architect of this tragedy has remained carefully concealed. I intend to prove it tonight. He rose swiftly, his coat swirling as he moved to the fireplace. From the ashes, he withdrew a folded letter one we had overlooked in the chaos of the initial search. Read this, he commanded. The letter was penned in a neat hand, its tone formal yet unmistakably menacing. To those who would question the past, do not seek where you are not invited. The game has only just begun. Cryptic, I murmured. But who would send such a message? Holmes regarded me steadily, the person who fears exposure most, and who believed Cutter would act without faltering. A knock at the door interrupted. U.S. Mrs. Hudson entered quietly, bearing a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanning the contents. Lestrade reports a startling development, he said. Mr. Blanchard has been found dead in his home, an apparent suicide, what with signs of foul play. I sat back, disbelief mingling with foreboding. Suicide, after all this? Holmes nodded gravely. Or a staged death to silence a man who might speak too freely. Without hesitation, we made our way to Blanchard's residence. The air there was thick with unease. Inside, the scene was meticulously arranged, no signs of struggle. Yet a small pool of blood beneath the window suggested otherwise. Holmes's keen eyes scanned the room, landing finally on a portrait hanging slightly askew, a photograph of Jonathan Blanchard, with his father and Pembroke. Look here, Watson. He pointed to the back of the frame, where a small piece of paper was taped. It was a note, hastily scribbled. The truth lies not in what was done, but in what was left undone. Holmes's gaze sharpened. A final message. We questioned the few who had seen Blanchard recently. Their accounts conflicted. But one detail emerged. The late-night visits from a woman none wished to name. Returning to Baker Street, Holmes's mind raced through possibilities. Then, with a sudden flash, it struck him. Watson, the true mastermind is closer than we imagined. Someone who moved with ease, whose presence was overlooked because of their quiet demeanor. I stared, puzzled. Holmes smiled thinly. Mrs. Ellery. The name hit me like a thunderclap. She was overlooked because no one expected ambition from such a gentle figure. But in reality, she possessed the means and motive, the desire to protect her husband's interests, to control the narrative behind the scenes. Holmes pulled a bundle of letters from his desk drawer, correspondence between Mrs. Ellery and Cutter. Coded but revealing a chilling alliance, she orchestrated the abduction, the destruction, and the intimidation. Cutter was her instrument. I shook my head, incredulous. Holmes continued. When Cutter's capture became inevitable, she arranged for Blanchard's death, an act of desperation to keep the secrets buried. The pieces aligned in my mind, a web of deceit spun by a figure no one suspected. Holmes stood and donned his coat. We must confront her before she slips away. At Ellery's residence, the air was tense. Mrs. Ellery greeted us with practiced calm, but her eyes betrayed something colder. Holmes addressed her directly. Madam, your game is finished. She smiled faintly. Mr. Holmes, you think you have uncovered all my cards, but some truths are too dangerous to reveal. Holmes's gaze was steady, dangerous enough to kill for. Her composure faltered, and for a moment, vulnerability flashed through her eyes. Yes, she whispered, because what you seek would ruin us all. Holmes stepped forward. Then it is justice you must face. As officers moved in, Mrs. Ellery's mask slipped entirely. revealing the desperate woman beneath a woman who had gambled everything on a lie dot in that final moment. Holmes's relentless pursuit of truth had shattered the last illusion dot as we left. The morning sun broke fully through the London fog, illuminating the city anew, its secrets exposed, its justice served, and a dark chapter finally closed. The following morning, Baker Street was shrouded in a silence that was not peace, but the breath held between justice and consequence. Holmes stood at the window, unmoving, gazing through the soft drizzle that blurred the waking city. On the table beside him lay the final collection of documents, Mrs. Ellery's letters, Cutter's confession, and the true will of Edward Pembroke, now protected under Lestrade's watch. I stirred a second cup of tea, unsure if Holmes even heard me. "You've done it," I said quietly. "The case is closed. She's in custody. The will is safe. And Clara," Holmes turned, "is not yet safe." There was no triumph in his voice, only a cold, lingering tension, as though the storm hadn't passed but simply shifted its shape. "She was the mind." "Yes," he said, gesturing toward the sealed envelope that had first tipped the scale against Mrs. Ellery. "But she was not working alone." I frowned. "You believe there's another?" Holmes moved to the desk and pulled out a document we'd both read and forgotten. The final page of Pembroke's diary. It held no damning confession, no detailed record, only a list of names. Holmes circled one with a charcoal pencil. "Ambrose Merton," he said, "Pembroke's private financial solicitor. He appears in every transaction, every property deal, and was present the day the conservatory was sealed. Yet he never surfaced in Cutter's testimony, not once. But he's vanished," I said. "The police couldn't locate him after the first inquiry because he made certain he would not be found." Holmes paced. Merton knew that the moment the will was revealed, the paper trail would point back to him not through direct crime, but as the architect of misdirection. It was he who ensured the falsified records passed inspection. He who advised Pembroke to keep the sealed room untouched. He who benefited from every delay and every doubt. A knock interrupted us. Lestrade entered, soaked and tight-lipped. "She's gone." Holmes closed his eyes. She faked a fainting spell, overpowered the matron, and escaped in a stolen uniform. No guards injured, but she had helped someone familiar with the watch rotations. "Merton," Holmes whispered. "Lestrade." "Step forward, frustrated. We've circulated her description, but she could be on a train by now, or halfway across the channel." Holmes nodded. "Come, let her run. The further she travels, the more careless Merton will grow. They'll reconnect." Lestrade hesitated. "And in the meantime?" Holmes returned to the table and unfolded the original inventory from the conservatory. "We prepare the case against him. The letters she burned, some had duplicates, sent to the registry as proof of land claim. We trace those, we find the bank transfers, and we make it impossible for him to breathe without risking exposure." Lestrade looked skeptical. "But the public will want closure." Holmes turned, his eyes cool and precise. "Then give them Cutter. Give them the diary, the will, and Clara's statement. The truth will stand, even as shadows attempt to blot it out." After Lestrade left, Holmes stood long at the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows across his face. He finally spoke. Not to me, but into the room. Justice is never clean, Watson, rarely complete. But even when it escapes our grasp, it leaves footprints behind. I sat quietly, watching him, remembering every step of the case, how many times we'd thought it resolved, only to find deeper layers beneath. Holmes began sorting the notes again, not for evidence, but to reconstruct the path for his own satisfaction. You knew it was Mrs. Ellery before the rest of us. He glanced up. No, I suspected. But the key was her silence. Everyone else had something to gain or lose. But she, Watson, she had everything to preserve. She was the curator of memory, the one who burned facts before they became history. I thought of Clara then free, but forever changed, of Blanchard, destroyed by ghosts of war, of Cutter, broken by obedience, and of the will, the last voice of a man who tried too late to set things right. Holmes rolled up the final parchment, securing it in his document case. The fire crackled, burning low. "Do you believe she'll be caught?" I asked at last. He paused, then replied, "Eventually. They always are. But whether the world will still care by then, that is another matter." And so it ended, not with cheers or headlines, but with quiet resolve. The truth was known. If not fully served, a villain walked free, another stood trial, and a young woman reclaimed her name, but at the price of innocence. For Holmes, it was not a victory. It was simply the nature of truth, unforgiving, unfinished, but undeniable. The lamplight in Baker Street burned low as Holmes leaned against the mantel, violin resting forgotten at his side, eyes lost in thought. The storm of the Pembroke affair had finally subsided, or so it appeared on the surface. Cutter was in custody, his confession thorough. Mrs. Ellery had fled, but her exposure left her a marked woman, a fugitive from both justice and society. Merton, the silent hand in the shadows, remained at large, though Holmes had already begun laying snares in banks and registries across Europe. Still, something tugged at the corners of his mind, a piece too quiet, too unremarkable, and yet persistent. "Watson," he said suddenly, cutting through the silence like a scalpel, "tell me again what Clara said to you just before we left her at her uncle's home." I blinked, surprised. She was grateful, naturally, still shaken, but composed. She said she would do her best to restore her family's name, that she hoped the estate would no longer be haunted by secrets, and she asked if the truth would be enough. Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, that was it, the tone of it. If the truth would be enough. He turned to the desk, rummaging through his notes until he found the photograph we had retrieved from the Conservatory Pembroke. Blanchard, Merton, and a fourth man, unnamed. Holmes stared at that fourth face, indistinct in the photograph's edge. "Do you see him, Watson?" I rose to look. "Yes, but we've gone over this image before. You said it was likely an estate lawyer or a distant cousin." "I did, but I was wrong. He is neither." Holmes moved to the files and withdrew a thin folio labeled simply Norfield Inquiry, 1879. It was the tribunal that had disgraced Jonathan Blanchard. He flipped the pages until he landed on a sketch of the presiding panel. There, seated to the left of Pembroke, was the same face, not a cousin, not a lawyer, Harold Brigham. Holmes said, a military attaché assigned to the colonial office. Quiet, unassuming, never mentioned in any testimony, but always present. My heart quickened. You think he's involved, I think, Holmes said. He may have been the one who set everything into motion. Pembroke's guilt, Cutter's silence, even Ellery's careful web, it all began with that tribunal. If there was someone influencing decisions behind the scenes, someone who stood to benefit from the fall of Blanchard and the control of Pembroke's estate, he let the idea trail off, the fire crackling quietly beside us. And where is he now? I asked. Holmes opened a telegram he had received days ago and tossed it to me. Appointed last year to the Colonial Office in Nairobi. Quiet promotion, no public notice, no retirement. And you believe this? Brigham might be the true architect. Holmes's face was unreadable. I believe he is the last ghost in this haunted affair. He stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the gaslights flickered, and the fog rolled across the city once again, curling down alleys and lanes like smoke from a long-doused fire. There's a reason this case leaves me uneasy, Watson. A case with this many layers doesn't end with one rest or even two. It ends when the last lie is spoken aloud. And something tells me Brigham has one more lie left to tell. I was silent a moment, sensing that we had crossed the finish line of one tale only to glimpse the starting gate of another. Holmes turned, not to me, but to the case itself, as if addressing the unseen forces still moving just beyond reach. This is how it begins. Again, a detail overlooked, a name too easily accepted, a face blurred at the edge of a photograph. He gathered his notes, filed away the letters, and laid the photograph on top, marking it with a small red thread across Brigham's face. Get some rest, Watson. We've earned it. But keep your revolver close. The game may be over, but the players haven't all left the field. As I closed my notebook and turned down the lamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The mystery of the Pembroke will had been solved. Justice, in its fragmented and flawed way, had been served. But in the quiet spaces between the facts in that fourth face in the photograph, in Clara's lingering question, in the name that had never been spoken aloud, there lived a promise that the story wasn't quite finished, and for Sherlock Holmes, no puzzle remained dormant for long.